evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's seminar hosted by the Transnational Legal History Group within the Center for Comparative and Transnational Law here at CUHK Law. Our speaker this evening will be Daniel Roger Maul, Professor of Modern and Contemporary History at the University of Oslo in Norway. Professor Maul's talk is titled From Decolonization to Decent Work, the International Labor Organization After 1945. In it, he will address the evolution of the International Labor Organization from an international organization that focused primarily on industrial labor in Europe to an institution with global reach and focus that addresses various issues of concern to workers around the world today. Professor Maul is the author of many leading publications on the history of the ILO. He is truly a leading global figure in this area, so we are very honored and privileged to have him here with us this evening. His publications include Human Rights, Development and Decolonization, the International Labor Organization 1940 to 1970, as well as the International Labor Organization 100 Years of Global Social Policy. Professor Maul will speak for around an hour. After that, we will open up the floor to questions and answers. If you have any questions that occur to you in the course of the talk, please send them via the chat to me, Christopher Roberts, and I will, you can indicate whether you would like me to read them or if you would like me to unmute you so you can read them yourself. But please feel free to get those into me at any point along the way. For everybody's information, the talk tonight will be recorded and posted online after the event. So if there's part of the discussion you want to go back to or something you want to share with a friend or colleague, you will be able to access it via the CUHK pages afterwards. Without further ado, let me hand over the floor to Professor Maul.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much for inviting me. I will share my screen and so that everybody has the presentation. So, everything in place?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, wonderful. So, thank you very much once again for having me. And although I would really much prefer to be there in person, given that here in Norway we are still in the midst of the winter. So next time I promised myself I will be there in person. So today I will talk about the history of the International Labor Organization, mostly after 1945, and I called this this presentation From Decolonization to Decent Work. But I will also, and I put the program here on this slide. I will start with a couple of more general overview-ish remarks. We'll talk about the question, whose organization is the ILO actually, and go into the history, in an overview of the history of the ILO as an agency of global social policy, with an emphasis on the global. In the second part, I will talk about the actual topic, the ILO and decolonization, and then in a third part, I will conclude with a couple of remarks on the more recent history from the 1990s onwards, under the two headings, decent work and labor standards. So first of all, let me say a couple of words on this question: whose organization is the ILO? The ILO is an agency of global social policy. Whose organization in the sense that is it an organization of all working people? That's at least what the ILO claims. But there can be an argument, especially from a historical point of view, that this has always been a distant aim of the ILO to become an organization of all working people, because there were mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion right from the start, and they have continued into our present. So not everybody who works is part of the ILO's conventions or expertise necessarily. From a different point of view, you could say that the ILO has been even more than an organization for all working people. It has included, from a certain point in time, also not only the workers themselves, but their families, their social environment, housing, for example, living conditions, in a much broader sense, so that the ILO, although being the International Labour Organization, could also be called a world social organization from a certain point. So that's why I'm asking this question, which should structure my presentation. Whose organization is the ILO? And to put an emphasis on decolonization, the process of the dissolution of most of the European colonial empires after the Second World War, is a good point to make about this mechanism of inclusion and exclusion. So, first of all, a couple of words, very, very general words on the ILO itself. The ILO was founded in 1919 as part of the Paris Peace Treaties, together with the League of Nations as a separate but integrated part of the League of Nations. So that also means that it is the oldest part of the present system of international organizations. It is today a UN specialized agency. The second point important always to mention when you talk about the ILO is that it is a tripartite organization. That is, other than other international organizations, all other international organizations which form part of the UN system on that level, it includes not only governments, but also NGOs. That is, trade union representatives and employers representatives from each country in its decision-making process. So that is something that makes for a very special culture of organizational culture in the ILO, this tripartite structure. The ILO is, the third point, first and foremost founded and understands itself as a standard-setting organization. So its main aim, its main task is to define and to adopt international labor standards. It has to this day adopted around 190 or precisely 190 international labor standards and an almost equal number of recommendations, less binding instruments. And these standards, these international labor standards, reflect the broad mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion because they contain more technical standards on occupational safety, on occupational health, but they also include human rights standards, freedom of discrimination, freedom of forced labor, and so on. I will go into that a little bit later. It has become, and this is also part of my story today, an agency of technical cooperation. So the ILO has a lot of technical cooperation projects going on, has been doing things in that area from at least the 1950s onwards. It's mostly technical cooperation within its core field of expertise in fields like vocational training, for example. And it is, and that is an often forgotten task that the ILO engages in. It is a provider and a pool for social statistics. And even in times of crisis, when the ILO was under pressure, this is something that has secured its survival on many occasions, because this is the area of the ILO's activities that most countries, most member states can agree on is useful. Because there's no other place in the world where you can get these kind of comparative statistics on all kind of social issues. So it is also a research institution, an educational institution. It has a training center for advanced vocational training in Turin, Italy. And it is also a research institution that publishes the International Labor Review, for example, which is leading journal in its area. So to talk about the history of the ILO is in many ways a history of the present, especially with regard to the 1998 Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work and the concept of core labor standards, which is a discussion that we're still leading today. Human rights discussions are very much based on the same premises in today's world. And the other thing is the decent work agenda. The decent work agenda is to this day the main heading for all the ILO's activities, and the definition of what constitutes decent work in today's world is a highly relevant question. I will go into that also later on a little bit deeper. So, whose organization? This question could also be posed to with a view to the present ILO Director General, which is Gilbert Humbo from Togo. In two respects, this is really, for me as a historian of the ILO, contains some really interesting history. He's the first Director General in the ILO's long history from Africa. That's one thing. And the claim for the voices of the global South being heard in the ILO and reaching the top echelons of the ILO has been there from at least from the 1940s onwards. So this is really an interesting development, but it's also an interesting development and interesting personality because of his position as the president of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which he occupied before coming to his current post in the ILO. So this is also something about the history of what is actually the main interest of the ILO in the world of work. And so an emphasis on agricultural work is also something that is interesting from a historical point. So I want to delve a little bit into the longer history of the ILO. So the ILO can be said rests on two different traditions from the 19th century, from the late 19th century onwards. It's first of all a social liberal legacy that comes into play. And this is important to emphasize that the original idea for an organization that would work with international labor standards came from this angle, not from a socialist, social democratic angle, but from a social liberal understanding. And it is very closely tied to the idea of free trade. And these people in the late 19th century, mostly a group that was gathered in the International Association of Labor Law or labor legislation thought about labor law as being transformative. So they were for free trade, and as a means to accompany free trade, they were also for an internationalization of social reform. So they were promoting social reform on the national scene, but in order for a free trade regime to work, international labor law had to be established, because social reform in one country, that's the simple idea behind it, could not be left as a competitive disadvantage to countries that wouldn't follow suit to social reform in their countries. So that's the idea of international labor standards that came from this direction. The other tradition which went into the founding of the ILO is the socialist or trade union legacy, the reformist socialist tradition, one has to say. And here, the story is much closer to the founding of the ILO in 1919. We have to look to the First World War, when many of the moderate or reformist socialist movements sided with their governments at war. And as a means of gratification, so the ILO could be interpreted as a result of that war. The other strong factor that comes in is, of course, 1917, the October Revolution in Russia, which put on the map a very strong radical alternative to international reform in the social area. So it gave an extra motivation to governments after the end of the war to promote an organization that would work with international labor standards. So these are the two legacies that went into the founding of the ILO. So now I'm closer to the topic, which is the time after 1945. So one has to emphasize that in 1919 and for much of the first decades of the ILO, at least until 1944, 1945, the ILO was a profoundly European organization. There's no way around this statement. The ILO was very, very far away from representing the working people of the world in their entirety. So it catered to a very specific sort of work. The European male, blue-collar industrial worker, which formed the norm of standard setting. And you can see that in the kind of labor standards that the ILO adopted throughout the year, very little in terms of agricultural labor, for example, very little in terms of informal labor, not at all, of course. So it was a very tiny fraction of the world's workforce that was actually the subject of the ILO's activities at that time. And I want to illustrate the bias the ILO had in many respects with a view to the problem of native labor, that is, labor in colonial territories. So when the ILO was founded in 1919, its constitution included a so-called colonial clause. So it was left to the discretion of the colonial powers themselves whether they wanted to apply standards that they had accepted for the mother country to their colonial possessions. In most cases, quite obviously, they didn't do that for a variety of reasons. But what happened and what brought the issue of colonial labor on the agenda of the ILO in the 1930s was that as a result of this, the politics, the economic policies that the colonial powers pursued during the time, systems of forced labor emerged. Because on the one hand side, most colonial powers after the First World War tried to extract more wealth, more revenue from their colonial possessions. At the same time, for the labor force that was needed for infrastructure projects, for example, to build the infrastructure, there was a reluctance or an absence, one could say, of social policies. Because for ideological reasons, but also for financial reasons, there was an extreme hesitation to invest in anything resembling social policy in the colonies. So what happened is, in order to get people to work, measures of coercion through taxation, through direct coercion had to be put in place, and which led to full-fledged systems of forced labor in many parts of the colonial past. And for that reason, in the 1930s, for mostly humanitarian reasons, a so-called native labor code, a collection of conventions dealing with colonial labor problems, mostly about forced labor, around the problem of forced labor, was put in place. But this was, and this has to be emphasized, a separate piece of standards. They were exclusively for colonial territories. And if you compare them to law in European countries, they were, of course, much less stringent than these laws. And that dualism changed only during the Second World War, when there was a new set of conventions, still separate, but which talked about social policy independent territories. It was more or less the acceptance that every person in the world was, which was not self-evident from the point of view of many colonial powers, was able to act as a universal worker. So social policies in Africa would have the same effect, same rationale, follow the same rationale as in European countries. That was something that was enshrined in these conventions on social policy independent territories. One could talk about other blind spots in this early. I've already talked about agricultural labor. One could talk about white collar labor, informal labor, indigenous labor, which was a mirror image of the way how colonial labor was treated. So indigenous labor in independent countries, Latin America, also South Africa, for example. This was hardly on the agenda of the ILO at all. It's different with women's work, but women's work was there from the start. But it's a very interesting. It could be another presentation on this topic alone, because in the ILO, actually to this very day, there are always two principles in competition with each other. One is a protective point of view, that women's work is a special category of work that needs special treatment, special protection. So one of the first conventions the ILO adopted was on maternity protection, maternity leave. in 1919, already at the first International Labour Conference, there were exclusion for women from night work. There was a convention adopted in the early 1920s. They all had in common that they tried to separate women's work from the other. And there was at the same time a push from women's activists, women trade unionists in particular, for equal treatment. And one important step on the way is in the 1950s and a convention on equal pay for equal remuneration for equal work, which is still a long way from total equality, but there have always been these discussions on whether a protective strategy or an equality strategy is the right one to pursue. So, to sum up this first part, the ILO's history from 1919 into the present could be told as a history of continuous expansion both geographically with regard to the membership, and conceptually with regard to the categories of work and workers that the ILO organizes. Geographically, already in the 1930s, there was a degree of expansion from this mainly European point of view into the Americas. Other than in the League of Nations, the US under President Roosevelt in the 1930s joined the ILO, which gave it a particular character throughout the 1930s, obviously, but it was also to Latin America that the ILO expanded early on. So the first regional conference of the ILO was taking place in Latin America in the late 1930s. In Asia, the first regional conference followed after the Second World War, after Indian independence, and the first African regional conference followed in 1960. So there's a history of regional expansion, of regionalization. So most of the work today of the ILO takes place, or a great part of the work of the ILO takes place in regional offices, in local offices all over the world. That is an ongoing process of decentralization from Geneva. That is one part of the story. And there has been a history of expansion with regard to fields of work. So the ILO has taken an interest early on in disabled workers, in migrant workers for the first time in the 1920s already, for informal workers from the 1970s. I will say something about that later on too. And in a wide range of areas, from multinational enterprises into lately the big group of domestic workers. So it's an ongoing process, far from being concluded, but it could be read as a history of expansion in that respect as well. So now I come to my second part, the ILO and decolonization, 1944 to 1990. So decolonization, the dissolution of European colonial empires in the period mostly from 1945 to the 1970s, early 1970s, can be seen as a dual revolution in the ILO's in the ILO's working. It is a revolution in membership first and foremost. So the ILO started after the Second World War with a membership around 45, under 50. And in 1970, it already had 130 member states. Most of the new members were former colonies. So it's obvious that this had to come with a change in the way how the ILO perceived of itself as an organization. It is secondly a revolution with regard to the ILO's program as a direct consequence. So decolonization creates new demands and new tasks for the ILO. And this is in particular in two areas which I want to emphasize. It's firstly that the ILO from the 1950s onwards becomes a development agency. So it is focused on the problems of developing countries as they have been labeled at the time. And secondly, it becomes quite independently from decolonization, becomes an agency for human rights. So it redefines itself as a human rights agency, but the way how it does is strongly shaped by the process of decolonization. So first of all, I want to go back to 1944 because it's important to see to this framework in which decolonization takes place from the ILO's point of view. During the Second World War, the ILO was in exile. It had sided with the Allied cause quite early on, earlier than the League of Nations. And in 1940, after the Nazi occupation of much of the country surrounding Geneva, it went into exile to Montreal in Canada, and it became a voice in Allied post-war planning from this point in time at the latest. In the Declaration of Philadelphia of 1944, which is a reform or a renewal of the ILO's constitution, the ILO gives itself a new foundation, intellectual foundation, a human rights foundation. And it defines a social objective for all policies. And it claims competence for all policies that can be related to social policies. So in fact, all kind of policies. This is the main part of the Declaration of Philadelphia of 1944, which is one of the first documents of its sort before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, before the UN Charter, which defines a human rights foundation for international organizations. So it says all human beings, irrespective of race, creed, or sex, have the right to pursue their material well-being and their spiritual development in conditions of freedom and dignity, of economic security and equal opportunity. And because of that, it defines a social objective that all national and international policies and measures, in particular those of an economic and financial character, should be judged in this light, in the light of human rights, and accepted only insofar as they may be held to promote and not to hinder the achievement of this fundamental goal. This translates in the Declaration of Philadelphia, although it's not its major emphasis, it translates directly to the issue of development, because it claims that to promote the economic and social advancement of the less developed regions of the world is one of its main responsibilities. And that connects to the Human Rights Foundation. It also includes implicitly the colonial territories. So this is a moment in history when the colonial authority is at a low point, or it's a very weak point, because as you know, some of the colonial possessions had been lost, including Hong Kong, including Singapore, to Japanese occupation from 1941 onwards. And that was still a fluid situation. So it was not clear whether the colonial powers would be able to return freely to their former colonial possessions. So it was kind of the idea to offer something that colonial rule in the future would look different from the past. So that is a bit of the historical context to this development map. So whether independent or colonial territory, all would follow the same kind of rationale. So there was a mandate to develop these, a mandate both by the governments, but also by the international community. So first of all, it plays out as the ILO becoming a development agency. And I put this a new deal for the world in the heading because it happens in the ILO under strong American, US American influence. So in 1948, the person next to Jawaharlal Nehru on the image, David Morse, an American ministerial bureaucrat from the Ministry of Truman's Department of Labor, becomes the new Director General of the ILO, and he stays in that position until 1970. So during this time, the American influence in the ILO is at its height, and Morse has also been one of the architects of Truman's Point 4 program. So the promise to render development aid to the world, either through bilateral agreements or through international organizations. And one of his first tasks is to include countries in that program, both with regard to Europe as part of the Marshall Plan, but also beyond Europe. So the ILO becoming a development agency builds on two cornerstones. First is that it did some technical assistance, as it was first called, missions to Southeastern Europe and Latin America already in the 1930s. So to advise governments on the introduction of social legislation, for example. The other is that it builds on what the ILO does in the years immediately after the end of the Second World War in Europe, becoming part of the Marshall Plan structure, becoming part of European reconstruction. And many of the ideas within these activities, for example, with regard to manpower, vocational training, building an infrastructure in these areas, is transferred to the first technical cooperation projects that go beyond Europe. So in the 1950s, it grows steadily into the second pillar of the ILO's activities next to standard setting. And it is from the start promoted as being the other side of the same coin with regard to the older activities in the area of standard setting, with the idea that in the transition from traditional to modern societies, as the social scientist view of the time modernization paradigm would have it, the ILO, with its manpower, with its vocational training expertise, would have a significant role to play, building an infrastructure that would facilitate this transfer. In 1969, the ILO launches a huge development-centered program, the so-called World Employment Program, which is both a reaction to the crisis of the first generation of development thinking, the high modernist thinking of transition from traditional to modern societies, which doesn't cause the effects, but it's also part of the UN's development decades. On this one is launched not by coincidence at the beginning of the second UN development decade, the 70s, and it's centered on the creation of productive employment for developing countries. As a historian of this era, I tend to overemphasize the World Employment Program, because within the ILO, or especially outside of the ILO, it's often regarded as a footnote. But I think it is more than that, and it just deserves to be explored a little bit more in depth, because what it is actually is, in the beginning of the 1970s in particular, it's a paradigmatic shift from growth-centered models of development to poverty-centered. So what the UN a little bit later calls a basic needs approach, a focus on poverty alleviation as a precondition for a sustainable development. That is something that is very strong in this ILO World Employment Program in the 1970s. It has been credited with so inventing the term informal sector, or promoting it, bringing it on an international scene, popularizing the term informal sector. And what is less seen is that it takes also place against the background of a UN-wide discussion on the establishment of a new international economic order promoted by countries of the global South, which is, of course, comes to nothing at the end of the 1970s. It's already on the defensive, but within the World Employment Program for a very long time, there are ideas of that development will only work if it is accompanied by redistribution. Redistribution between rich and poor countries, but also redistribution from growth on a local, on a national level. That is the idea that if you want development, you have to lift, especially the poorer parts of the population, through land reform, through taxation systems, and so on. That is, of course, something that is also has a very short life on an international scale. But as an idea, it is quite strong, and it has a who is who of international economic knowledge contributing to the program. On the images, you see Hans Singer, famous UN economist, Dudley Sears, the director of the Sussex Institute of Development. You see W. Arthur Lewis, actually the father of the first generation of development of the dualist thinking, and you have Amartya Sen in his early career years, one could say, contributing to this program, which if anything, leaves a very rich research legacy in areas like rural development, participation of women in the development process. So that is one side of the coin. The other is, as I mentioned before, is human rights. So decolonization and human rights, one can see on this chart that actually all of what the ILO today, or almost all of what the ILO regards today as its core labor standards, core human rights standards, freedom of association, equal remuneration for equal work, forced labor, discrimination in employment and occupation, are adopted in a very short period of time, right after the Second World War, in parallel to the decolonization process. Plus, there are now human rights references in several technical conventions on migration, for example, on employment policies. So this is obvious that there is a connection. And I see this connection in two areas from the ILO's point of view. Human rights, to emphasize human rights as part of the developing process, is a way to counter the negative effects of decolonization on standard setting. Because it's very clear that most of the standards that the ILO had adopted up to the 1950s are irrelevant for most of these new nations, or hardly relevant in many. So to shield international labor standards from total evaluation in the course of the decolonization process, in the course of a shift to development policies, is to define human rights standards that would be applicable in all conditions for all people. That's one point of view. A more positive point of view in the 1950s in particular is that the ILO's integrated approach to development, so that human rights would become a tool of development. So following in this modernization theory inspired thinking, following the path of Europe, of the industrialized countries, in a transition from a traditional into a modern society. And so if you, put in simple ways, if you grant trade union rights to workers, they will fight for their rights, and in the end, everybody would profit, and societies would become more democratic and more prosperous at the same time. So there's a connection being made, and that is very strong in the 1950s. There's talk of an ILO way of development, which includes standard setting into the development process. So I want to put a spotlight on two areas where you can see how that works out, how that plays out in reality. One area is freedom of association, which translates more or less directly into trade union rights. So there are two conventions, one on freedom of association from 1948 and on, in a supplementary way, on the right to collective bargaining of 1949. Both are promoted, especially in the Cold War context, as being the way to prosperous and democratic societies in the course of decolonization. But in the beginning of the 1960s, there is more and more a tendency that governments in many countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia, curb these rights in the name of a state of emergency, which is under development in these countries, which requires collecting of all forces under one common goal, the goal of development. And many leaders in these countries, like on the Guinea's Ahmed Sékou Touré, have a trade union past, so they know exactly about the political potential of trade unions from the anti-colonial struggle. And they start to see trade unions, independent trade union organizations as potential competitors for power. Also, many of these trade unions are strategically well positioned. If they are railway workers, if they are dock workers, they're very important for the economy. So they have a lot of bargaining power. So in order to manage this power, in many of the countries of the global south, there are very restrictive trade union laws in place in the beginning of the 1960s. This is an ongoing discussion, of course. The other area, very delicate area, is the area of forced labor. So I already mentioned the 1930s conventions around forced labor as part of a native labor code. There's a new human rights convention on the abolition of forced labor from 1957, which is focused on systems of forced labor for political and economic purposes. So it's probably clear to everyone where this comes from or what this has in mind. The discussion starts immediately after the Second World War. It has the Nazi concentration camps in mind, but in the end of the 1940s, it becomes a weapon for American trade unions in particular to attack the Soviet Union and their system of coercive labor. So this discussion is highly politicized in the ILO. So it sees the Soviet Union and its allies in the docks to start with, but then this discussion becomes gets a very different take or drift away when decolonization continues, because many of the African countries, for example, introduce labor services, mobilize labor, sometimes as part of the military for younger men in particular, in order to push the development. All of these labor services are completely in variation with the Forced Labor Convention of 1957. And that becomes clear from the start. So there is a situation in the early 1960s when countries that still cling to their colonies in Africa, like Portugal, attack these newly independent African countries for entertaining systems of forced labor. So this is a highly politicized diplomatic debate, and it's very complicated to get around. But behind it, for historians, it's very, very interesting, because there's an almost philosophical debate on what constitutes coercion in free labor market societies, in the socialist countries, in the global south, and so on. So what brings these two discussions together is the question of human rights and development, or human rights versus development. And mostly the discussions play out in the later sense. So I would go into the third and final part, the ILO since 1990. So what characterizes this period immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War is a loss of momentum. There are many things to say about this. So the advance of neoliberalism, especially in development thinking, is a problem for the ILO, which has always been wedded and even been part of the emergence of Keynesianism on an international level throughout from the 1930s onwards into the 1970s. So this is really a problem for the ILO. It's on the defensive everywhere. It doesn't play a huge role in the transition of the former socialist countries of the East, of Russia, into the new era. So there is a lot of more to be said, but let's keep it at that. There's a loss of momentum. The ILO doesn't have a very strong voice in this period in particular. And what it does in the 1990s, the later 1990s, definition of core labor standards, I mentioned it already, and the decent work agenda is a direct response to this situation. There are three core debates from the 1980s onwards that can be put under the heading the ILO and globalization. There's the social clause debate, there's the declaration, and there's the decent work agenda. The social clause debate about the inclusion of ILO human rights standards mostly in international trade agreements faces a lot of resistance in this era for the reasons already mentioned, but also increasingly because it is mostly promoted by Western governments and Western trade unions on the international scene, while it is rejected by most countries from the global south as a tool of protectionism. And there's much to argue about that, but there's certainly truth in it if you see like the protagonists of this debate from the Western side. There are good arguments to see it as a way of safeguarding in a protectionist manner. So the discussion becomes very, very clear. The situation the ILO is in becomes very clear in the founding of the World Trade Organization, when the ILO finds closed doors, mostly because countries from the global south do not want the ILO to be part of that. And the ILO answer to this is mainly core labor standards. So in 1998, the ILO adopts a declaration of fundamental principles and rights at work, which includes freedom of association, freedom from forced labor, the two conventions, freedom from discrimination, which includes gender equality, and discrimination in employment and occupation, which is more direct against racist systems. It has been discussed mostly against the backdrop of South African apartheid, and the abolition of child labor. The older minimum age standards, but also one standard on the worst forms of child labor, which comes actually after, but is already under discussion at the time. So the thing that has to be said about the declaration is that the idea is that by membership, each country commits in principle to these standards, regardless whether a country has ratified the conventions or not. just because of membership, they should be committed to this. So that can be regarded as successful for the ILO to have this declaration adopted in 1998 under the circumstances. But it's also seen as problematic by some others. So the Decent Work Agenda of 1999-2000, launched by a new Director General, the first from the Global South, if you so will, from Chile, Juan Somavia, is a response to the criticism directed against the concept of core labor standards, because it's crystal clear also from the discussions in the 1990s that if you define core labor standards, that says also something about all the other standards, which then become less important. And there have been critics which see it as the ILO's bowing to the neoliberal zeitgeist at the time. So what the Decent Work Agenda is about is a confirmation of the commitment to all working people everywhere in the world, and also implicitly a commitment to all labor standards as social rights. So same spirit carried by the Declaration of Fair Globalization of 2008, also in the centenary declaration of 2019 once again. Decent work is a very broad concept, obviously. According to the ILO, there's a lot of history in this formulations. It involves opportunities for work that is productive, comes with a fair income, security in the workplace, social protection, so it comes with social policies, but also personal development, social integration, freedom, people to express their concerns, to organize, participate. So it's a commitment to freedom of association once again, equality of opportunity and treatment for all women and men. So that's the most important heading for all of the ILO's activities, has been since the early 2000s. So now I'm almost finished. Want to leave my comfort zone as a historian for a moment. I felt I have to say something about what's the more recent developments, but of course I'm a little bit out on limb here. There are contradictory trends. So core labor standards and decent work is, from a certain point of view, a success story, or are success stories, because it has given the ILO new visibility, new credibility, also in the international arena. It's part of the Sustainable Development Goals as such. There's also a different point of view that sees the ILO relevance more threatened than ever today. There are ongoing questions of representation of work and workers in the ILO. 2011, one of the last conventions that the ILO actually adopted was on domestic work. That included, once again, a huge group of workers that had been excluded for many years, although they count in millions and very important for the economies of many countries. So there's no way around that, an ongoing crisis of standard setting. It's only been 2 conventions of the 190 that have been adopted in the last 20 years. One is the one on domestic work. The other one is from 2019. and it's safe to say that it has been possible to adopt it because of the centenary, which is on violence and harassment in the world of work. Many see it as the end of the road. If you take, for example, the growing importance of platform work, precarious work in the digital economy, the question of algorithmic governance in workplaces, these all would qualify for standard setting, but there's actually no perspective for standard setting these days. There's just too much resistance to more standardization in the organization. So that poses the question, whose organization once again. I would like to conclude, and these are my last 3 slides, with 3 key parts of the 2 constitutions the ILO had, the one from 1919 and the one from 1944, from the Philadelphia Declaration, which can be asked the same questions that I asked all the time. So whose organization is the ILO? What it actually is its purpose, or has been in history? First is, whereas universal and lasting peace can be established only if it is based on social justice. So this has a reference to a peace between nations. It's no coincidence that it has been confirmed during the Second World War, but it also refers to internal peace and the significance of social justice within that frame. The second one is poverty anywhere constitutes a danger to prosperity everywhere. So a reference to interdependence in this area. So can be translated to the question of migration, for example, in today's world. And last but not least, it's this one, which I still find most fascinating sentences in international documents, that labor is not a commodity. So meaning that it cannot and it must not be treated as a commodity, because it's part of the human condition. It's part of human dignity. So decent work agenda picks up on that. But the question is, of course, is that true? I don't think that it reflects the reality in huge parts of the world. Labor is, in fact, treated as a commodity almost everywhere. So it's a distant goal, more than a reality. So I want to conclude here, and I would like to thank you for your attention, a little bit more than an hour. So if you're interested in more of the history, so Chris has mentioned it in the beginning. So this book on the ILO's 100 years of history is accessible open access through the ILO's and also the publisher's website. So if you're interested, I'm just I hope you allow me this little piece of self advertising in the end. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Maul, Daniel, for that truly fantastic talk outlining, the over 100 years now of history of the International Labor Organization. I'm sure, many know so much more about the various different pieces of that history than they did before. Although I think, as naturally covering so much, there's so much more to delve into about so many different times and places and controversies along the way. So absolutely very appropriate to share the book, which is one place people can find out more. So we open the floor now to questions and answers. So if you have any questions, please send those in to me, Christopher Roberts, using the chat function. I'm going to start off with the chairs. I have so many questions, but I'll limit myself to just two, taking the traditional chair's prerogative, and they're sort of potentially closely connected to one another. So that's why I asked them together. So this is about sort of the, as you were talking about what happened during the Second World War, the 1944 Philadelphia Declaration, and the subsequent period. So I guess so one of the questions is how anti-colonial was the ILO in that period, right? So as you just, as you mentioned, right, the war, we have sort of Britain, France, the Netherlands, Portugal still as major colonial powers around the world going into the war. Japan has displaced a lot of them in Southeast Asia. Of course, the war itself is a huge challenge, but none of those powers want to give up their empires after the war, right? As you were noting, sort of the ILO generally seemed to be, maybe once upon a time they had more sway in it and in the League of Nations and so on, but by that point in time, they seem to be weakened. So just how much, where would you say the center of gravity was within the ILO? And then relatedly, but distinctly in a way, so I was really fascinated by your highlighting how all of those sort of core ILO convention standards get developed sort of between, I mean, you can talk about 1944 itself, and then sort of between 1947 and 1958, right? This really fertile period for the ILO is kind of setting all of these fundamental rights standards. But what's interesting from sort of the history or historiography of human rights point of view is that you get the Universal Declaration and, the American Declaration, but you kind of, things get stuck. You don't get the international covenants until the 1960s, after the major wave of decolonization. You don't get the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination until the 1960s. So there's this sort of, between the initial sort of enthusiasm and in the European human rights system, they have these colonial exceptions, and it doesn't really come much online until the decolonization as well. So you have this sort of attention to human rights following the Second World War, but this kind of a period of things not moving very much in that context, where it's actually really fascinating that in the ILO context, things are able to move so much. So I don't know if you have any reflections on that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for the two questions. I might start with the first one, with the second one. So for historians of human rights, generally the ILO is fascinating territory. Again, mostly because of the tripartite structure, because it adds a different layer of discussions through the participation of civil society organization, if you so want, and or an additional diplomatic level also. I think the most interesting thing about the 1940s and 50s as the formative period of ILO human rights standards, or human rights standards in an era of human rights declarations, is that specific dynamics of all of these discussions. Because in contrast to the UN, where these UN conventions cover all aspects at one time in one document, these are different discussions that move along a timeline in which, in the background, the Cold War and decolonization develop, play out. And that can be seen directly into these discussions. I mentioned the forced labor discussion. It started in a point in time when the US were practically in command in the ILO. and the Soviet Union was not yet again resuming its membership, which only happened in 1954. So it was something launched exclusively to attack, to put the socialist countries in the dock by the American Federation of Labor, also by many governments, many Western governments. But it changed its character completely when it was actually discussed and adopted in the end of the 1950s, because then many countries like India or countries or Egypt would join the debate with a very different point of view to start with. And so that gave the discussion a completely different take than as if it would have been discussed together with all these others. It's the same with the discrimination debate, which happened against the background of apartheid, which developed into a full-fledged system only in the later part of the 1950s. And so this was a very symbolic discussion. So there was no way for the colonial powers, for the US, who was very critical of the discrimination convention, to resist it actually because of diplomatic. And that is where you can see, as a historian of human rights, where human rights really mattered in diplomacy. So because you can always say, okay, the US didn't ratify most of these human rights conventions, so it doesn't apply it directly to its own law for well-known reasons. But it mattered. It mattered how to all the participants in the discussion, how that convention would look like in the end. So it's a very good way to take a different perspective also on the role of countries from the global south in human rights discussions, which is regularly written down a little bit, or as being purely cynical or functional. But if you see to these discussions, that's just not the case. It's just not the case. The other questions: how anti-colonial is the ILO at the time? So there, maybe one should make a distinction that I didn't make in my presentation between the ILO as an organization and the ILO as an arena of political debate. So the ILO as an organization is not per se anti-colonial, but it certainly is an organization that navigates what it sees as its own organizational needs, so very, very, very skillfully in the period. So in concrete terms, when the discussions on freedom of association reached the colonial arena in this later period, and when there is a constant struggle on what kind of trade unions do the colonialist powers actually want. Of course, non-political ones, ones that would not question the colonial power structures. There you see the ILO officials in a position of constantly pushing the limits, constantly trying to rewrite the documents that are sent in for discussion for conventions or so on. So there is I wouldn't call it anti-colonial, but I would definitely call it balanced in the sense that they know that they would have to answer also to what countries like India demand from the ILO in order to stay relevant. When it comes to the ILO as a political arena, it's pretty much the same. It's pretty much the same thing. So you can always see the power relations in the international system playing out. But as I said about human rights discussions, you very often see specific dynamics unfolding that are not identical with the simple power relations in the organization. So there's often so in effect, the ILO turns out to be quite anti-colonial in its impact on the discussion. So that at least would be my preliminary take on it.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much. Yeah, very interesting reflections on a very interesting time period. Thank you so much. Yes, so we have another. I can see this conversation is one that interests and excites people's interests and sort of connections in various ways. So we have another question from the audience on this point, and I guess just to be brief, we only have a few moments, but saying on the other hand, could it be that the focus on trade and increased profits for those with capital has enabled the WTO to ignore the rights of workers, including fair wages and safe working conditions, so that profits can be paramount? So I'll just put that one out there. I think that will be our last question to address in the time today.
I mean, it depends on from what perspective you answered it. So it's safe to say that especially countries from the global south do not see the ILO as relevant any longer in the 1990s. When the WTO is founded, they try to get what they can from this new organization. And the ILO is just a voice that disturbs this picture, because it brings in something that would further reduce the usefulness of such an organization in the period. From the ILO's point of view, I mentioned that before. I want to make that point again. There's no way around that the ILO depends on it in its success on the willingness of governments to support it, and to support in particular standard setting. Because if the ILO is reduced to the role of a mere service agency in areas like technical cooperation, in areas like social statistics, it loses its value for part of its constituents, which then again trade unions make up for the biggest supporters of the organization. But it's a very complex discussion, because then the ILO also depends on the willingness of governments to introduce regulation. And as I said, the question of platform work is an area where the ILO provides fantastic expertise, publishes reports on it that are extremely useful. But what is really needed, in my view, I can say that, is regulation. And if there is no willingness to regulate, all this other work might be completely in vain. So there has to be a certain degree of willingness to let the ILO participate in international regulation, or it is not relevant. Yeah, that was maybe not the most structured answer to that, but I'm myself, I'm struggling with this problem of the ILO's relevance in today's world, and what's actually needed to restore it. So because there's a certainly a wide agreement that an organization like the ILO is needed in many parts. It would be a better place to live in. The world would be a better place if the ILO had more powers to, or more momentum to shape the discussion. But that is just not the world we're living in.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think both on this issue and on so many of the issues, there's so much we could discuss. There's so much clearly of great importance. There are so many different, we've run out of time. I don't even have time to ask about just sort of, I think doing ILO history shows how much you need to know about sort of major global politics, interstate politics, workers' history, sort of the employer's presence there too, how organizations function, the sort of transitions over time in an international organization. Yeah. So there's so many different perspectives and layers and components. But unfortunately, our time tonight has run out. So it falls to me to thank you so much, Daniel, for that truly incredible talk. I'm sure everybody else, that they're forcibly muted by our system, so they can't applaud you audibly, but I'm sure they are all applauding behind their screens.
Thank you. This was fun, really.
It was a great pleasure and honor for us.